Ορθοδοξία σοφοστήρ, Εκκλησία στο στήριγμα και διδάσκαλε, των μοναστών ικαλώνει, των θεολόγων υπέρμαχος, απροσμάχητος, Γρηγόριε θαυματουργέ Θεσσαλον.
The Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who at ever present fillest all things, treasure of good things and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from all impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So, this coming Sunday, we'll celebrate the second commemoration in just a few short months of our Father among the Saints, Gregory Palamas, Archbishop of Thessaloniki. He was also, if you think back, commemorated on the 14th of November, which is celebrated in honor of his repose, or the marking of his repose. But this one, however, which we'll celebrate on Sunday, as we'll sort of see in continuation throughout the rest of this homily, marks the sort of continuation of the feast of the Sunday of the Triumph of Orthodoxy, which we celebrated last Sunday. And so, just the fact that he has two feasts, like St. John of the Ladder and St. Mary of Egypt, which come in the coming weeks, should be an indication to us that this is a figure of great importance to the Orthodox Church and to Orthodox tradition. And yet, despite the fact that there's sort of an obvious importance and an obvious gravitation in our tradition towards the writings and person of St. Gregory Palamas, he's generally not that well known. His life, which was written by one of his disciples, later the Patriarch Philotheus Kokinos, has yet to be translated into English as far as I know. There is a modern Greek translation, I believe, floating around. And his most important work, the one which he's probably most remembered for anyway, the Triads, has only been translated in pieces, and at that, not very well. And so this has led to sort of a certain ignorance about St. Gregory, which we'll hope to rectify at least in part for us tonight. So seeing this, today we will look very briefly, because there's certainly very much one could say about the life and works of St. Gregory. We'll take a very brief sort of synoptical look at his life. We'll present a synopsis of his central contributions to the formation of Orthodox dogmatic consciousness, before offering just a few observations on why he's celebrated on the upcoming second Sunday of Lent, immediately following the Triumph of Orthodoxy. So to begin with, St. Gregory was born in Constantinople in 1296 to devout Orthodox parents. His father was a Byzantine senator who ensured that all of his children, not only St. Gregory, received the best in secular education, but also that they received instruction in holy learning, or the teaching of the gospel. He would take them on frequent trips to the monasteries that surrounded the area and were within the walls of the city of Constantinople, in order that they might develop relationships with devout and holy people and receive spiritual advice and become used to the practice of confession from a very, very early age. Constantine, this is St. Gregory's father, his own holiness was quite well known, and there are a certain number of stories recorded of this great senator's personal holiness. But nonetheless, as holy as the man was, he would only exert a short influence on St. Gregory's life, because he died when St. Gregory was only young, when he was about 7 years old, and thus he was left to the caring arms of his mother for the rest of his upbringing. His mother, Kali, picked up exactly where her husband left off, and ensured that this dual education, on the one hand secular and on the other hand holy, was sort of continued in the life of her son. In this education, St. Gregory excelled. In fact, he excelled in every area of his studies, particularly in the study of the philosopher Aristotle. He was once, in fact, asked to give a lecture about Aristotle at the imperial palace, at the conclusion of which his own teacher, St. Gregory's own teacher, turned to the emperor and said that if Aristotle himself had been there, he wouldn't have been able to explain himself with as much ease as St. Gregory had, even as a young child, So he was definitely adept as a student. But St. Gregory's brilliance, his natural intelligence, was not solely the product of natural ability. It also was developed through a deep devotion and a deep life of prayer, even at a young age. Though he was very small, and though he was very smart at this very small young age, he had some difficulties in the area of memorization. He couldn't memorize things very easily. And so the child, all by himself, began the practice that before he would take up any of his school books, he would make 3 prostrations before the icon of the Theotokos and venerate her, asking her a blessing upon his studies. And so we see, even at a young age in St. Gregory, this union between devout practice and the study of his learning. So, despite all of his successes in his youthful studies, St. Gregory always remembered that the true wisdom lay in the keeping of God's commandments, and that the glory associated with his academic pursuits was fleeting. It wouldn't remain behind him. So, through all of his studies, throughout the whole run of his life, this early life anyway, runs this theme of monasticism. St. Gregory always felt pulled towards the monastic life, and this sort of desire kept popping up over and over again for him, even as a young child. Finally, it got to the point where he decided this was really something he was going to pursue, that he believed God to bless this way of life for him, and this is what he should do with himself. And so he began to attempt to live a form of monastic life, or as close as he could, while he was still living in the world. And so he would fast very strictly. He would make sure to attend all the services. He would do prostrations and prayers all through the night in order to test his own sort of ability for the monastic life, to give himself sort of a trial run. And as one might expect, he came out by God's blessing and grace successful in this trial. At the same time, while he was endeavoring to sort of live this monastic life while yet a layperson, he sought out the advice of Theoleptus of Philadelphia, who we know is also a saint, would later be canonized as saint, and whose writings are included in the Philokalia. So on the one hand, his spiritual struggle towards the monastic life was combined with spiritual direction from a future saint who stayed very close by him during these years. So having passed this sort of period of trial and seeming to have come to a decision, and with the blessing of St. Theoleptus, St. Gregory decided that he would approach his mother and ask for a blessing to become a monastic. And so he went in, approached his mother, and began to give his case for monasticism, and particularly for why he should become a monastic. And his mother, hearing his words, was herself so moved by the speech about monasticism and the centralness of monasticism to the life in Christ that she herself decided she would embrace monasticism. And then on top of it, having overheard the speech, the saint's young brothers and sisters — he had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, as well as some of the servants in the household — they all came into the room and declared their intentions to embrace the monastic life as well, all in the power of St. Gregory, overhearing St. Gregory's wonderful speech to his mother. And so shortly after this, St. Gregory's mother, Kali, took St. Gregory's 2 sisters, and they went to live in a monastery in Constantinople. And St. Gregory took his 2 brothers and took to the road towards Mount Athos, where it was his hope that they would all become monastics together. So the 3 brothers, upon arriving on Athos, headed to a skeet just outside of Vatopedi, and there they put themselves under obedience to a monk named Nicodemus, a very holy monk named Nicodemus. And here the 3 of them lived together for several years. During this period of time, St. Gregory developed the habit of praying with the following words, which are noted very clearly in his life. A lot of emphasis is put on them. He would say over and over again to the Theotokos, "Enlighten my darkness, enlighten my darkness, enlighten my darkness." Now one can imagine one who had enjoyed such feats of scholarly endeavor early in his life, praying repeatedly over and over again in humility to have his darkness enlightened. Could we imagine a scholar doing such a thing today? But nonetheless, this is what St. Gregory did. And he did this because he understood that book learning really meant nothing to God. What he really needed to know was God's will, and how to apply it and keep it within his own life. And so, in answer to this repeated prayer over and over again, enlighten my darkness, the Theotokos sent St. John the Theologian, or St. John the Evangelist, to St. Gregory, and he promised to be an aid to St. Gregory throughout the rest of his entire life, especially in this regard, in the discernment of God's will. So, from there, St. Gregory would remain on Mount Athos until somewhere around 1325, when, because he wasn't living sort of within the context of the Canobium, the bigger monasteries have walls around them and are well protected. Because he was living in a skete with his elder, they were subject to attacks, especially by the Muslims, which were starting to attack by this period. And so they weren't able to safely remain in the skete where they had been. And so around 1325, St. Gregory was forced to leave along with his brothers. And the idea was at this point, if it were God's will, they would head on through Thessaloniki and pass right on by it to Jerusalem, where they would venerate the holy sites, and then go to take up dwelling in the deserts of Sinai somewhere, where, of course, there were revered fathers and sketes where they could live a life of seclusion. However, God does not always allow the things as we desire them in some cases, and in many cases for his own reasons. And so as St. Gregory was beginning to pass through the city of Thessaloniki, one of the nights St. Demetrius appeared to him, telling him that he should go no further, but that he should remain within the city. And the reason for this providential intervention would become clear in future years. But nonetheless, we know that the saint heeded this vision of St. Demetrius, did obedience to the saint, and remained in the environs, at least, of Thessaloniki after this. Here in the city of Thessaloniki, we know he was ordained to the priesthood, and then after his ordination, he founded a hermitage outside of the city of Thessaloniki in Berea, where he lived in extreme strictness. In fact, during this period of time, we know St. Gregory spent 5 days of the week in absolute seclusion by himself, and would only allow the visitors and the other brothers to see him on Saturday and Sunday, so that he could speak to them and that they could be mutually benefited. But generally, he observed a very, very strict mode of life during these years outside of Thessaloniki. So this form of monasticism was quite pleasing to St. Gregory. He loved it very much. But again, after about 5 years, he was forced to leave this paradise, this paradisal monastery, because of, again, Muslim attacks, and they weren't able to stay in the secluded area where they were. So after this, St. Gregory heads back to Mount Athos again, and there, when he's on Mount Athos, he experiences one of the probably more well-known visions and miracles that are recounted in all the recounts of St. Gregory's life that we hear. Here he saw in his own hand a cup of milk, and the milk was continually overflowing as he held it. And then suddenly the milk changed to wine and continued to overflow and overflow and overflow. And suddenly an angel appeared to him in the context of this vision and told him to share this cup with others, that it would be his task in life to share this cup with others. And when he left the vision, St. Gregory explained that he understood the milk to be the sort of fundamentals of the gospel, and the wine to be the higher teachings of Orthodox dogma, and so that he would be called upon at a certain point to share not only the fundamentals of the gospel, but the highest dogmatic teachings of the Church with others. Sometime around 1334, while he's still living on Mount Athos, he was made, at the request of the protos, or the head, the chief of Mount Athos, so to speak, he was made the abbot of Esfigumenu monastery, because they had a difficult time sort of picking an abbot from among their midst, so they had requested that one be appointed to them. And so this was St. Gregory. The protos asked St. Gregory to take the position. And here, while he was with the Brotherhood, St. Gregory performed a large number of miracles, which we won't go into detail, but nonetheless performed miracles for the aid of the brethren that were there. But as happens in the lives of many of the saints, there soon developed jealousies, particularly because St. Gregory was young. Some of the monks had a very hard time sort of adjusting to the idea of having a young abbot, and they rebelled against him. And so St. Gregory, in humility, resigned his position as abbot in order to preserve unity within the Brotherhood, and happily have restored himself to a more quiet mode of life. Now, around the same time, if we move from Athos towards Constantinople and Thessaloniki, to the bigger cities, a Latin monk who often dressed himself up as an Orthodox began to circulate around the east, between the cities of Constantinople and Thessaloniki mainly. And what he taught was essentially papal theology. And because he was dressing himself and presenting himself as an Orthodox theologian, this caused a great deal of distress in both cities and created a lot of confusion amongst the faithful. This monk named Varlam was continually giving talks everywhere, but he was teaching things that weren't Orthodox at all, at least not in their roots. And his main point was that he pushed the idea that we come to know God by means of philosophy, rather than through the ascetical life and the commandments. This was his main point. We know God through philosophy, through the intellect. We don't come to know him by living the life of the gospel and the commandments. And in fact, Varlam, even in his writings, if we read them, he makes fun of those who claim that the life of the commandments and the life of the gospel is what creates the presuppositions for one to receive divine grace. He he repeatedly makes fun of them throughout his writings, tells jokes about them. He used to call them navel gazers, was the term, because they would always pray looking down, trying to keep themselves undistracted at prayer. So he would make fun of them. And here, in Varlam's presence in Constantinople and in the east, particularly around Thessaloniki, is the reason that St. Demetrius had prevented St. Gregory from going on his intended journey to Sinai, and also the reason for the appearance of the vision of the cup of milk and wine. It would be in conflict with Varlam that St. Gregory would be called to express the Church's theology in the highest possible terms, and it was on account of his need to confront Varlam that he was required to stay in Thessaloniki by God. So the next few years, essentially we'll skip through a bunch of things, but the next several years of St. Gregory's life, many years in fact, are essentially tied up in this conflict with Varlam, writing back and forth, writing to followers of Varlam, particularly a character named Akindinos, who was also translating things from Latin and circulating around. So a lot of St. Gregory's time during this period is eaten up with writing against Varlam in protection of the faithful, but at the same time trying to call Varlam to orthodoxy, trying to present the Orthodox faith to Varlam, what he didn't understand and what St. Gregory wished him to have. These labors, St. Gregory's labors against Varlam, would culminate in two councils held in Constantinople sometime around 1341, in which the Church officially condemned both Varlam and his follower Akindinos, who I mentioned earlier. So it seemed, at this point anyway, that there was a certain triumph for orthodoxy through St. Gregory Palamas. But this wasn't the end of things. Like all of the great fathers and teachers of orthodoxy, St. Gregory found himself caught up in intrigues and the jealousies of others. And a change in the political circumstances of Constantinople resulted in St. Gregory at one point being thrown in prison. Seeing this, seeing their rival in prison, Varlam and Akindinos quickly appeared back on the scene and used the opportunity to try to overturn their conviction at the council and have St. Gregory's theology condemned. And it just so happened that at this time on the patriarchal throne there was a particular schemer named John Kalekas, and he conspired with these two to have St. Gregory excommunicated. And so they had a robber council and had St. Gregory excommunicated. But as we know, the gates of hell will not prevail against the Church, and the truth will not allow itself to be hidden. And in 1347, two more councils were convened, which both deposed Kalekas and reaffirmed the condemnations of Varlam and Akindinos and exonerated St. Gregory, holding him up as a champion of orthodoxy. Shortly after this, in fact in the same year, St. Gregory was elected to the office of Archbishop of Thessaloniki. In his new office, the saint's sufferings continued. It took, in fact, 3 attempts for him to enter his city and take his seat on the archiepiscopal throne of Thessaloniki. Every time he tried to enter, there was some problem, some political strife, which prevented him from taking his throne. Not only this, he suffered a last attack from Varlam and Nikindinos, who tried one more time to have St. Gregory excommunicated, but this attempt was blocked, and St. Gregory prevailed once again. Then St. Gregory was at one point called to Constantinople to meet with the emperor, but on his way to Constantinople, his ship was captured by the Muslims, and he spent an entire year in captivity. During this time, he bore his captivity extremely bravely. There are a number of accounts of his years in captivity. Mostly what he ended up succeeding in doing was converting jailers and translators. He was often in the position where Muslim officials would bring him in to have sort of a conversation, thinking they were going to make a mockery of him. And as the translator was translating between the local official and St. Gregory, the translator was slowly being convinced of the Orthodox faith. And so everywhere he went, St. Gregory ended up leaving a trail of converts to the Orthodox faith. And so his words combined with his witness and his willing suffering of his captivity ended up convincing a lot of the Muslims, and many of them became Orthodox. Finally, though, things began to slow down to some extent for St. Gregory, and in 1355 he was released from captivity, and he was allowed to be returned to Thessaloniki for what would prove to be his final years. During these final years of his life, St. Gregory focused his particular attention on preaching. He was very intent on teaching people through his homilies. In fact, he's left us about 60, which are preserved. They're now circulating in an English volume, and they're an absolute treasure. Every Orthodox Christian should be reading St. Gregory's homilies. They're that wonderful. On top of this, he worked as a tireless pastor during these last years, and here again, just as he had done as abbot of Esfigmenu, he performed countless miracles for the healing of his flock and for their spiritual benefit. Finally, having been visited by St. John Chrysostom the day before, we know that St. Gregory Palamas reposed peacefully on the 14th of November of 1359. So, apart from St. Gregory's holy life and witness, we know that this great figure is one of the great contributors to the clarification of what we call Orthodox epistemology. By that I mean he clarifies how the Orthodox Church has always understood that we come to know God. Now notice that what I've said here is clarification. St. Gregory did not formulate a new theory, but rather he drew together what was the universal teaching of our holy tradition, so that it was more easily accessible. All he did was take what had been scattered across the centuries in the various writings of the Fathers and compile it into one place, so that it could be easily found, and expressed it in a manner which is most beautiful. So, but what provoked him to do this? Well, he, like all the other fathers, was provoked to do this when someone started to deny this teaching. What we have to remember is that this teaching is so fundamental to orthodoxy on how we come to know God that no one had really questioned it. There had been no real need to articulate it in the way St. Gregory had up until this point. It was just absolutely beyond question that the way he was saying things was the way things were. It wasn't until Varlam's time and the time that the papal church begins to interact that we see a new form of theology develop, and someone has to begin talking about how theology is done in a very fundamental way. So, to review a little bit, in essence, Varlam, who later became a bishop of the papal church himself, he left Orthodoxy, that is to say, and became a bishop in the papal church, was an authentic representative of the papal church and papal theology. Thus, not to put too fine a point on it, he argued that God was most accurately known through the intellect, through philosophy. To this dangerous, dangerous claim, St. Gregory responded in a very orthodox, fitting manner. First, he says, the intellect is a natural gift, and it is good if it is used for the right purposes. In fact, what St. Gregory compares it to is a snake. He says for it to be useful, you have to cut off its head, which he says are strange notions about God, and you have to cut off its tail, which are strange theories about nature. I.e., if we are to use our intellects to its proper purpose, we have to restrict it to solving practical problems of Christian living. We have to use it in order to figure out how to apply the commandments to our life. This is sort of the vision for reason which St. Gregory sort of puts in place. When we use our intellect to know God, he says, all that we end up with is ideas about God. Now, if we think about this in terms of a practical example, we could think of it if someone's describing to us a person we don't know. Let's say, I don't know, Desmond Tutu. I don't know Desmond Tutu. I've never met Desmond Tutu. But someone can describe him to me. Well, when I've taken all the information that someone gives me about Desmond Tutu and I put it in my mind, do I know Desmond Tutu personally? Not at all, right? Not in any sense. I have a picture of him, and it might be right a little bit. It might be totally off, but it's just a picture. I don't know him personally. There's no contact between me and Desmond Tutu whatsoever. So in this, St. Gregory is trying to tell us the intellect is not a theological tool. It is not a means by which we come to know God. So second, what he says is that knowledge of God, if it's not something intellectual, what is it then? How do we come to know God? St. Gregory, and indeed the whole Orthodox Church's answer, is that our knowledge of God is based on the experience of the grace of God in our heart. And on this point, St. Gregory quotes St. Dionysius the Areopagite saying, "It is better to call what we have, this experience of knowing God, union rather than knowledge, because it's not really knowledge, it's not through the intellect, it's God dwelling in us." So to call it union rather than knowledge is a more accurate description. We shouldn't really use the term knowledge for our experience of God. For us as Orthodox then, we believe that the true knowledge of God is just an expression of this union which occurs with divine grace in our heart. So lastly, how does St. Gregory say we come to gain this experience? His answer is to a certain extent simple and in another sense very complicated. He says fundamentally, we come to know God, we come to experience the grace of God in our hearts by keeping the divine commandments. But by this he means something very specific. When he says keeping the commandments, he means something very particular. For St. Gregory, keeping of the commandments is synonymous with living the ascetical life. This means fasting, this means vigil, and this means particularly the practice of unceasing prayer. So that to a certain extent, the goal of this is that the body becomes rightly subjected to the soul. The body serves the spiritual ends of our being, of our existence. And so this is why St. Paul is able to say that whether I was in the body or out of the body, I know not, because his body had been so subject to his soul, he barely knew that he was attached to it. So having seen a little bit about St. Gregory's life, at least a brief sort of run over, and having seen at least the core of his contribution to the Orthodox tradition and sort of highlighted his importance at least, one question I think sort of remains for us to cover, and this is why do we celebrate him in Lent, immediately following the Sunday of the Triumph of Orthodoxy? And I think there are a few reasons for why the Church has done this, why the Church has reminded us particularly of St. Gregory at this point in the Church year. First, it's in recognition of the fact that St. Gregory lived his entire life to preserve his brothers and sisters in the Orthodox faith by means of teaching and confession, i.e. by his life, such that his name actually came to be included in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, which we all recited on Sunday. And his opponents' names were included with the anathemata, which you probably should have read but likely didn't. Second, last Sunday, the struggle to maintain the Orthodox faith with regard to the veneration of icons. The threat to the icons was a threat that originated from the East. It came from the East, that is from Islam and from Judaism. Because of course, as you no doubt heard in homilies all over the place last Sunday, as Christians, we believe that God became man, and thus, as a result of his becoming man, we were able to depict him. For the Jews and for the Muslims, they have no such belief, and therefore there's no ground for any sort of depiction. And so the threat last Sunday was from the East. This Sunday, in the form of our Lam, the threat to our orthodoxy came from the West, from papal theology. So in a way, having the Sunday of orthodoxy, where the threat came from the East, and the Sunday of St. Gregory Palamas, during whose time the threat came from the West, forms a sort of completion, a sort of pairing, so to speak. Finally and thirdly, St. Gregory's whole sort of theological production centers on an attachment and a reiteration of the importance of the ascetic life, i.e. the necessity of spiritual struggle. As we saw, the whole basis for the union, for the coming of the grace of God into our souls, as St. Gregory described, lies in the context of the ascetic life. So the celebration of St. Gregory is really a call for us to aggressively live out in our own spiritual lives the sort of asceticism which he outlines, especially in his work, The Triads. And so, to this extent then, having seen a little bit of St. Gregory's person, a little bit of his sort of theological contribution, and a little bit about why the Church has placed this celebration where it has, let us use then St. Gregory as a beacon to guide us through the rest of our Lenten journey, and as an encouragement to embrace the life of the commandments, which is synonymous with the ascetic life. Amen.
Papa, thanks again so very much. I'm glad that you harmonized both the feasts so well, because especially in our day, with the fight within and without, with dealing with ecumenism, I'm wondering if you could briefly comment on the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas in fighting off against the heresies with this. The Church's struggle today against ecumenism.
I lost most of that.
Could prescribe for us in this day. Okay, it's okay. What I was asking was...
Yeah, you're okay now.
Today, many times, people... Can you hear me okay now? Okay. Today, many times, people will say, well, you know, St. Gregory Palamas lived 700 years ago. That was a different time. You know, how's it applicable to our lives today? And to, you know, back with how you harmonize both those two feasts of last Sunday and this coming Sunday, you know, the struggle today in the Church is with ecumenism, pretty much, ecumenism/secularism. What could you say from what you know of St. Gregory Palamas to prescribe a spiritual prescription to combat that today? And commenting on people who say that are the fathers, not just St. Gregory Palamas, but the fathers applicable to our lives today?
Well, I mean, I think one of the fundamental ways, and this is as has been put to me before, and I think put quite well. As we said, the fundamental teaching which underlies everything St. Gregory says is a call to the ascetic life and a call to move away from secularism. In that, you know, in order to live our lives in the context of prayer, fasting, and vigil. This is an absolute diametric opposition to the manner of life which currently surrounds the ecumenical movement, for example. Caloperesy is the name of the day within the ecumenical movement. It's all great feasts, it's all fun, it's exactly the opposite of what St. Gregory says needs to happen if we're to understand and come to know God personally. So in that way, I think, there's a direct response to those sort of the modern movements today in what St. Gregory is saying, because he's reminding us that we can't pursue these things in meetings, we can't pursue them in great feasts, we can't pursue them in caloperesy generally. We can only pursue these types of things through a life dedicated to asceticism and the keeping of the commandments. And so in that way, I think he speaks very directly to what's going on today.
Yeah, because like I said, it's very prevalent, even on the Sunday of Orthodox in our town, not to hear things at all that are dealing with the Sunday of Orthodoxy or in harmony with St Gregory Palamas, and it's very, very, very difficult because people will say, well, the bishop said this or the priest said this. Well, who am I? I'm just a simple parishioner. Well, what do I know? And it's a great struggle because at the same point in time, if we're not careful with these things, we can fall to the other extreme of going to schismatic bodies, leaving the church, right? So it's a very big struggle, a struggle of ignorance, a struggle of our passions, a struggle of secularism, a struggle of ecumenism, and I'm wondering if through God's providence the Fathers gave us St. Gregory Palamas. If I'm not mistaken, was St. Gregory's the feast always the second Sunday of Orthodoxy, or is there any minor revision? Something is just coming to my mind.
I mean, there may have been a revision at some point. I mean, the one that was centrally kept was always the one on the 14th of November.
Yeah.
So about the establishment of the second Sunday, I'm not sure whether it was moved within the context of Lent.
Because you mentioned very rightfully that Holy Mary of Egypt, St. John the Latter, St. Gregory Palamas. So the Church is putting forth these huge examples to us, and it should, in a good way, as we say, Greek, must problematize, that it should sort of trouble us in a good way, saying, well, why is the Church doing this? And again, these are examples for us to live up to, because again, many times people will say, well, that's for the monastics, so what about for us in the world? We live in the world, and if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's an important one. Fundamentally, I mean, what's obvious from the writings of St. Gregory is that whether we're monastic, whether we're a layperson, whatever our station in life, we're all called to union with God. We're all called to have the grace of God come to dwell in our hearts through purification, through the purity from the passions, through battling the passions. This is the universal calling of humanity. So in this regard, the generalities of what St. Gregory is speaking of is universally applicable. Since we have a universal calling as all people, what he's saying is universally applicable. There's not one of us that's going to get away with living a life other than what St. Gregory is saying. Now, that may be tailored to a certain extent by virtue of the world. For instance, something like illness. We know that fasting is something which is gauged to sort of humble the body and the spirit. Now, when God visits us or allows us to suffer an illness, sometimes that takes away from our ability to fast, but the goal is the same. So the details of the life might get altered a little bit, but none of us are going to get away from it. If we live a life of calopercy, if we live a life of ease, we are not going to be saved. That's the reality. It's the harsh reality of orthodoxy. If the Protestants have their belief in faith, and that's it. I have faith, I'm saved. That's not what orthodoxy teaches. Orthodoxy teaches that we have to struggle with all of our existence to come into union with the living God, with God who is a person, who is a living entity, who desires to come and take his abode in us. And we have to make room for him to do that. If we don't make room for that, we will not be saved. That is the reality of the struggle we're facing. We live in a time where this struggle is difficult, where we're surrounded by things that are pulling us away from it, but we have to fight back hard against those things.
That struggle to make our hearts and our whole bodies an abode for Christ as well. How can we not fall to the other extreme, like I said earlier, of not, leaving the church and joining fanatical offshoots under the guise of being an Orthodox church? It's another struggle that's very difficult as well.
Well, I think one of the important things we have to realize is, again, and I think it ties right into what St. Gregory Palamas is telling us in his works. St. Gregory tells us that there are people, living people, who have come into communion with God, who know the will of God through their experience, through living the ascetic life. These people can guide us on the straight path, so to speak. Those people can see where grace is and where grace isn't. They know what's blessed and what's not blessed. We can guess. We can take principles. Even for me, my own teacher, who's, I won't say the words in praise I'd love to say of him, because I know he wouldn't be pleased with me. But one of my own teachers was probably one of the greatest scholars, patristic scholars of our age, and he would always say, he said repeatedly in my presence, "I'm nobody. I can take the writings of the fathers and I can guess based on my long-standing career of having read them over and over again, but I can't tell you for certain this or this in situations where it's unclear. For someone to know the will of God, they have to have acquired the Holy Spirit through living the ascetic life. It doesn't matter how much reading we do, it doesn't matter how much study we do. These things help. These things help because they give the Holy Spirit a context to speak through, and they they inform us, so to speak. But they aren't the be-all, end-all. What we need in the end is grace. And so what we need to do in these times where things are so unclear and difficult is to find people who have lived the ascetic life, and that's the test, the true test. I mean, that's the difference between a guru and a real spiritual father. A real spiritual father is someone who has lived the ascetic life in its fullness. And that's where a reading of the patristic tradition comes in, because by reading the fathers, we can hazard a better guess as to whether the person standing in front of us is someone that's following the life of the fathers or not. And so what we really need to do is find these people that have acquired the Holy Spirit, and these people will guide us through these questionable situations where we're not sure what we're supposed to do.
Anyone else, please? I don't have a model of it.
There's got to be something. At St Gregory Palamas, there's so much I didn't say.
Yeah, I know. Well, you know, it's interesting because also linking up everything that you said back now with respect to prayer, the prayerful life, it's something that we, of course, all of us need to focus on more than what we're doing. That's why we have this period of Greek Holy Lent, not exclusively, but let's say more toned up. Is I don't know how much you spoke on with Bodlam and St. Gregory Palamas dealing with the Jesus prayer and how important that is. It was in those times, and especially in our times today, because that's a very, well, the fathers tell us, a very, I don't want to say quick, but a very sure way to attract God's grace.
Yeah. And it's also just the way of sheltering us. It's like a buffer to a certain extent between the world that's surrounding us. If we're constantly calling on God, number one, we're constantly calling on God, so we're reminding of ourselves that like that God is everywhere present. At the same time that we're doing that, we're reminding ourselves that we're in the presence of God, so that's going to guide our actions on one front. But at the same time, it's also preventing our mind from being scattered, from going to all these distractions that are all over the place. If I'm walking down the street saying the Jesus prayer, it's unlikely that I'm going to see a sign somewhere, and then that sign is going to create a bunch of thoughts, and next time I know I'm going to be on a beach in Vienna somewhere. If I'm using the Jesus prayer, I'm keeping myself sort of away from that, from my mind wandering. And so it's a buffer between the secular world that's around us and that's always trying to lead our minds away from our hearts, so to speak.
And lastly, Papa, it's very true that you mentioned, sad but true, that St. Gregory Palamas is not well known, if at all, by many of us who are Orthodox. So let's hope and pray one day that a church, it helps to have a church established to the saint. That's the way the saint would become more well known. We have a church established to St. Gregory Palamas so that we can go and venerate. And in Thessaloniki, the beautiful church dedicated to him, we were blessed to go and hopefully to have a relic of the saint somewhere here in our vicinity we can go and venerate and ask for his intercessions. I won't keep you any longer, Papa, but yeah, anyone last request? Okay. We want to thank you so very much for spending your time with us again, and God willing, in a month, I guess 3-4 weeks. Well, actually, I should say in 2 weeks we do the panel, the pure panel discussion.
Well, we pop in off and on anyway, so.
Yeah, it's just that. It's just that. Okay, Papa, if we could just end with a brief prayer, we would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. O Christ, the true light, who dost enlighten and sanctify every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be shined upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments, by the intercessions of thine all-immaculate Mother and all the saints. Amen. Good night. The Lord bless you.
Benedicta, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.